We're now going to adjourn for lunch, but not adjourn very long because the boxes are outside, I think. Is that right? No?
Turns out we have better food than expected.
Oh.
It's going to be a lunch buffet. So we still have time and people can grab their food.
Okay.
We're going to break for 15 minutes.
Good. 15 minutes. Be back here, and we have a great afternoon. Pardon? Yeah. Good.
I got someone else doing it when you just I'm saying, one thing, I was like, people in some people in there, but one is that. You got a key set up, similar concept. Privacy, security, that's good.
Hey, everybody. Excuse me. If you guys haven't gotten your lunch yet, we're going to reconvene in about 10 minutes. So please go ahead and get your lunch, and you are welcome to eat it inside so you don't miss any of the meeting.
Folks, we're going to start in a few minutes. The bells are ringing outside, so people will be coming back in. If there's something you want to get prior to our startup, head out and get it. To do it. Well, folks, we very much appreciate your grabbing your lunch and bringing it in here to the room. I'm going to start my countdown in just a minute. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, now we're going to move to our afternoon panels, and thanks to everyone for bearing with the time pressure that we have. It's an important issue, a vital issue. We want to clearly take advantage of this very impressive assemblage of wisdom to ensure that we have every opportunity provided for the sharing of that wisdom. This afternoon, we move into a focus on what health system leaders can do to make a difference in this area. And we're going to start off by giving a sense of some of the interesting dynamics in the marketplace that provide an important context. And it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome the panel moderator, Wendy Nilsen, who is a program director in the Smart and Connected Health Program, Directorate of Computer and Information Science at National Science Foundation. Obviously, NSF does everything they can to keep their finger on the pulse of the opportunities and to facilitate the creation of new technologies and their application. And Wendy, thank you very much for being here and for moderating this panel.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I think you're going to find this to be an exciting panel. I'm not going to take up any space in this panel except for to get to ask some really smart people some interesting questions. So what I've asked each of our panelists to do is to start by introducing themselves, and we'll start with Bram, and then to actually describe what they think interoperability, what's their interoperability within their organization, how do they define it? And then what efforts they're making toward this. So we'll start with that. So Bram?
Yeah, so good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. This is quite the collection of people from all sorts and all experience backgrounds. And I feel a little out of place just as being one of the device manufacturers, not the EMR or the electronic record systems, but actually a company that certainly has played in that space, but we create the data that we're trying to make interoperable. And so the invitation that you provided to come out here, Claire, was in a way well accepted, but also a little scary. So I head up the Global Research Organization for GE Healthcare. What do we do there? We interact with clinicians. We interact with our folks that create devices, be it an MR, be it an anesthesia machine, be it a monitor. And so we constantly deal with data that is so diverse. And as I listen to this morning's discussion on making this data interoperable, the first thing that comes to my mind is our data within systems is not interoperable. An MR scan, for instance, we have a DICOM header clearly sitting on top of that, and we'll come back to the DICOM header just a little bit. That provides a little bit of uniformity, but if I now think of ECG data, or if I think of data coming from an anesthesia machine that I want to be monitoring, and that I want to now, per your comment, change on the fly based on the patient's performance, based on their blood pressure, based on their status. That data is now a signal that I need to be able to deal with. And not only that, I want to be able to record it and pass it on to the entire data system and the patient record that then has to move on to a different hospital. So if you take what we heard this morning and drill that down to the actual data, not only does it have to be somewhat uniform, but it also has to be quality data. And the data has to have a semblance of when it is read by a radiologist or a clinician in one hospital, it better have the same outcome as if it's read further down the road, or if it's read by a primary physician, or if it's read by an orthopedic surgeon, whatever. And that is not done yet. The data that we create is not uniform yet. The data that we create still has variance, and if we have complete interoperability but still a high level of variance, I don't think we've completely solved the problem. So what have we done? We're spending quite a bit of time making sure that the data is uniform, making sure that the DICOM header is consistent, and we make sure that the quantitative information, the data report, the decision structure that we build into our scanners is effective and consistent and robust every single time. The reason I want to come back to DICOM just a little bit is as I read the report this morning, and two things, or last night rather, two things stood out. One was an example of a plane taking off and the pilot wanting to know whether or not the landing gear dropped when they're landing. And I'm thinking, you know, the EMR is really the, if you will, the supercomputer or the pilot. But we're creating these wheels that need to send signals that a clinician can read. And those signals, like I said, are somewhat varied right now. And so it really requires, somebody made the statement earlier, that the vendors need to get together and create a uniform structure. That was thought to be DICOM. And remember, DICOM came about because users of the data said it's too varied.
Can you explain DICOM, just for in case?
Oh, yeah, DICOM is it's a structure that we put on top of data that makes the image, if you will, workable and accessible throughout a PAC system or an EMR system. And that's a standard set, standard header, standard set of code that sits on top of the image. And we thought it was working. But as new data came about, as it went from a color, say from a grayscale to a color image, the DICOM header wasn't sufficient anymore. So we started tweaking with the DICOM header. And we started, every vendor started building in specific proprietary fields that you're familiar with this, that now took away from the standard, right? So now we have DICOM, I think we're at 2.0, maybe 3.0, and it's no longer a standard. There's a subset that is standard, but there's variance. So we've introduced variance, and part of that is, and this is part of the problem. Did I go yellow already? Is we try to compete with each other, and so that came up this morning as well. The competitive nature, and I wasn't really thinking about the competitive nature of institutions. I live in Salt Lake City, and we have Intermountain Healthcare, and we have University of Utah, and patients don't go from one to the other. Part of that is because of the care, but part of that is because the systems aren't interoperable. We have competition in our industry where we like to create proprietary stuff. And proprietary stuff doesn't lend itself well to interoperability. And so I think, personally, for this 40,000-foot view to actually work, the vendors, the device manufacturers, need to have a much tighter interaction in order to accomplish that interoperability. I'm, by the way, colorblind, so I...
Oh, no. Then we actually do not, just for the rest of the panel, we don't have the timer on.
Okay. So, take us home, yep. DICOM works, but the only way for us as vendors to conform is, we don't like to hear it, but if there's structure put in that purchasing agreement. And we're a little wary of it, because that means we're gonna get told how to do things, and vendors don't like that as much. But at the same time, the only way to impact a uniform change is to impact it through purchasing behavior.
Thank you. So next is David McCallie from Cerner. So we'll have another kind of perspective.
Thanks, Wendy. Good afternoon. I'm David McCallie, Senior Vice President for Medical Informatics at Cerner. I've been there about 27 years. So I have to be somewhat of an optimist about this, or I wouldn't have kept doing it so long. So what I want to do just briefly is to describe what Cerner's activities are in the macro, meso, and micro layers that I think the report sort of lays out pretty clearly. There's a blur at the boundaries between those layers, but I think it's not a bad way to organize. So I will do my best not to sound like a vendor advertisement, but since half the time when I'm speaking, I'm in the mode of advertising my vendor products, you'll forgive me if I slip across.
And I'm going
a
to
little
take
bit.
detailed notes.
So, Rob and I are well acquainted with each other. We spend a lot of time on calls together for groups that, in fact, work on interoperability. So we have a comfortable relationship and can tease each other easily. At the macro level, Cerner is cautiously optimistic and encouraged by the TEFCA proposal. We have been operating with some other vendors an entity called Commonwealth, which is a brokered query model that is quite similar to the essence of the TEFCA proposal. So we believe that there is some proven viability in the market, that it's both technically achievable, and that, in fact, vendors can collaborate and make it work. So that's a very encouraging thing to us. We have some concerns about scalability and some of the technical issues and how fast it goes forward that we'll incorporate in our feedback to Don and his team. But in general, we're really quite excited about TEFCA to sort of become the infrastructure to solve the distributed record, the fetch of the federated record that Mickey described earlier in the morning. At the meso level, we are enthusiastic adopters of and supporters of FHIR, and in particular the Argonaut project, which has brought a bunch of vendors and providers together to try to make sure the FHIR standard itself evolves in appropriate ways, that it's actually usable instead of just being a standard that got a vote, because a standard that's gotten votes doesn't mean it's any good. It has to be sort of used in the real world. We have plenty of standards on the shelf that healthcare standards bodies have cranked out that have never been used to any effective degree. Fortunately, with FHIR, the uptake is rapid and is generating lots of feedback so that HL7 can pull that into the spec. Argonaut has done that with respect to the APIs exposed to both providers and consumers under the Meaningful Use program. There's a new project called Da Vinci that's getting kicked off that's going to follow the parallel of the Argonaut for provider-payer APIs based on extending the FHIR data model. So we're quite excited about that. Cerner itself has seen over 1,000 app developers come to our playground, our sandbox, where they can test their app ideas out. And of that 1,000 or so, about 25 have made it all the way through to now being offered to our customers to incorporate into their system. So these are third-party apps that didn't exist before FHIR that are now actually available to our customers to plug into their workflow using the Smart on FHIR protocol, which we are also big fans of. And then at the micro level, this is one I know the least about. I'm actively involved in the macro and the meso, but the micro is a different division in the company, so I'm going to quote some data that I got from that team. But we have been working on trying to create our own device interoperability bus where we could coordinate the activity of the various devices that have to plug in at the bedside and then into the EHR. And in so doing, we've developed over the course of the last 10 years over 1,000 device drivers from 160 different manufacturers. We have 15 full-time engineers doing nothing but writing device drivers. So we welcome the thought that some of that work could be offloaded to a standard as long as the standard is adequate and is extensible so that you don't run into the problem that Bram just described, which is a device maker comes out with a new functionality, they want to differentiate themselves on the market, the standard doesn't handle it, so they extend the standard. That's a tension that's good for us probably in the long run, but it does make for some of that complexity. So there we go, macro, meso, micro, and I'll shut up.
Okay.
For now, right. Don't count on me staying quiet.
See, I told you they'd be interesting. Rob Klootwyk from Epic is next.
Yes, good afternoon. I'd be remiss if I didn't make a clerical update to everyone. I do not have an MBA. I noticed I was listed as that. I actually have an engineering background, which, based on this morning, I think is a good thing.
That's a great thing.
So I've been at Epic 12 years and have focused my efforts on our Care Everywhere team and interoperability in general and kind of the question of what does that mean. I'll get there. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story similar to what Mickey did with his kind of history. And I think we've all taken different journeys in life, yet we're all here in this room, and I'm humbled to have the opportunity that my journey's stopped here for a little bit, just hearing the different perspectives today. I've had a lot of notes a lot of smart brains in here that have experienced things differently, and that's how real innovative stuff happens, is hearing all these ideas, going back and conjuring it in ways that are unique, and applying your lessons. So this year is actually a fun year for us, 2018. It's our 10th anniversary from our first patient record exchange. So Care Everywhere went live 10 years ago. And I know the definition of interoperability, and others have mentioned this, of maybe it was too narrow of just provider to provider, but it had to start somewhere, and that's where it started in 2008. I remember too, back in 2011, spending a lot of my time working with the Interprogram Office and the DoD and the VA on the Wheeler project. We worked to create the Joint Business Technical Requirements, which I don't know if anyone of you have read that. It's well over 100 pages with a ton of appendices and XPaths, and how do you even exchange a CCD? That was like new then, and trying to figure that out. And there weren't standards when we created Care Everywhere, and then those evolved, and of course now everything is based on standards. But that was an important part of history, I think, with the thinking back to the NHIN, that's what the Wheeler project was based on, the Nationwide Health Information Network, right? The idea there was there would be HIEs, a select few, and every provider group would connect to one, and then the Nationwide Health Information Network would connect all those, and we'd have nationwide interoperability. I think everyone knows that didn't happen, but the eHealth Exchange, which is what that's evolved to, still serves a very important role. That is a network that is how over 100 of our customers interoperate with the VA today, and another few dozen are connected with the Department of Defense, and another almost 100 with the Social Security Administration. That is the only avenue to do that. So that network serves a very specific purpose, and it works great. But it was around that time that it became increasingly obvious that there wasn't going to be a single network to rule them all and have that kind of ubiquitous interoperability occur. And so there was pretty widespread agreement that what we needed was a common agreement, some sort of rules of the road that could connect all the various networks that had naturally grown. And that's what Care Equality was founded to do in 2014, so 4 years ago now. And what I think is unique about that effort is it was entirely optional. It wasn't vendor-driven by any means. It had providers, broad stakeholders, pharmacies, payers. In fact, Dr. Hodgkins is in here over there. He's still the chair of the board and has been since the inception. And that took quite a while, about 18 months, to come up with an agreement that people could sign on to voluntarily, mind you, and agree with in order to bring their networks to the table. And now that covers over 90% of hospitals and clinics. So not just Epic, all are underneath a current implementer, and I know we're actively testing with Cerner and as they bring their HIE platform live this year. So that's been a kind of a fun little journey that I've been on, and the way kind of I've seen it. And connections are being made. I think that there's no doubt to that. A lot of connections are being made, and there's talk about making the data better, and I think that's definitely the natural progression. But we're getting to a point where it's time to move from being able to view more to being able to do more with the data. And that's why I'm happy to be here today and kind of announce something that we're creating at Epic, which is one virtual system worldwide. So all of our Epic customers will have one virtual system worldwide. And there are three main components to that. One is, and play along with me for a little bit because we like our names, Come Together, which is how you kind of gather all of that data, so you need the connections. Another is Happy Together, which we announced a little while ago, and I think some of you may have known that, which is the ability to view it natively along all your local and locally documented information and making it easy to consume. And the last is Working Together, which is where you can take actions across systems and be able to collaborate more closely on your care you're providing and at the population level as well. So some examples are Images Everywhere, Book Anywhere, Telehealth Anywhere. You get the theme here. But being able to use FHIR standards where they exist, other web services, and extend where they don't. So we'll continue to raise the ceiling. And of course, we're always one of the first to certify for the floor for the certifications. We're continuing to push the ceiling up, and as we do, we'll share our lessons learned with the community and contribute back to the standards development organizations, HL7, Argonaut, Da Vinci, everything you heard that David said too, we're heavily involved in, and look forward to an eventual day where everyone's on one virtual system across all platforms. I believe that is the future. And I also believe in a world in the future where the payers and providers are collaborating so closely that is seamless. And as a consumer, I have a 5-month-old, and I didn't know what it was going to cost for me to bring my son home with a Billy Rubin blanket for a few days until it was like months later, and I get the claim. why do claims exist? I think if we can be on the same page about what this is, that it's appropriate, I'm following what I should be doing, I'm on a pre-approved care pathway, why can't I know up front so that I can make an educated decision? So anyways, that's some of what we're up to. I'll turn it over to Chuck.
Okay, so next is Chuck Martel from Anthem.
Yes, good afternoon. Chuck Martel from Anthem. As you know, Anthem is a broad-based, multifaceted healthcare company. I'm based in Minnesota. Welcome, Peter, to Minnesota nice, Minnesota cold, and Minnesota snow when you get there. But we're spread, of course, all around the country in several dozen states. It's actually a very big privilege and honor for me to be able to join with the panelists and with the rest of you today to try to address a persistent chronic condition that you may have heard of. It's clinical data disorder. And I think we may have been able to diagnose it pretty effectively. And as we're moving into the treatment plan, I'm pretty excited about what lies ahead for us to do that as well. Next week marks 114 years since we had a tragic fire that was 40 miles from here. It was known as the Great Baltimore Fire. Fire departments from Philadelphia, New York City, and here in DC immediately raced to the city to be able to try to address, come along their colleagues and try to address the blaze. But tragically, they arrived and they were unable to actually assist in the remediation of that fire. And I think some of you may know why. The hose couplings were not compatible. So the crews that joined were not able to address the fire that was raging and would actually claim over 1,500 buildings, over 70 city blocks, over 30 hours of that raging fire burning because of the incompatibility of the hose couplings so that the water could not flow freely and unencumbered. You can see, obviously, the easy connection for us that here we gather 114 years later, committed to the prospect of compatible connections. It only took them, after that tragedy, 1 year to develop a standard and to assess the 600 different implementations of hose couplings around the country and choose one and go forward. Now, granted, we're talking about a multi-tiered data interoperability issue, which is far more complex than hose couplings in fire departments. And it's an engineering problem, to be sure, but it's a business problem as well, just as it took them that opportunity to assess that. I loved it. It resonated very well for me earlier, talking about it in terms of, or framing it as patient safety. I think there's something that we really need to kind of drive much more aggressively and assertively with respect to that. Just as water is vital for public safety, for health and wellness, data too is a common good that must flow to be effective. I'd like to share with you the context of how we view information and a couple of examples of what we're doing specifically around that. We do believe that information is a common good. It is not something that should be a part of a defensive bunker mentality and preserved for that kind of interest. Dr. David Brailer, who many of you know, he stated at a recent meeting in our company that nothing matters more than the data. Well, that just resonated very well for me. I wrote it down and I've been reminding everybody that since. Data is our healthcare system's most valuable and to date most underutilized asset. It's one of our greatest assets at this point for our data and analytic capabilities and the insights that are generated by 732 million claims annually. We use it for a variety of different purposes. I'll skip ahead a little bit. We are dedicated to the principle that wisdom is a precursor for wellness. Wisdom combines a growing storehouse of knowledge with its application. Simply stated, wisdom is a function of two vital elements, discovery and delivery. And after Julia's remarks earlier, I felt I have to add a third D now, decision. It's one thing to have the discovery and the insights that are generated. It's another thing to provision that and make that available to the point of care or to the decision maker. It's another thing still for the decision maker to actually incorporate that in their workflow and their progress notes and the rest. Much has been achieved recently to address the delivery side. HIEs and data exchange standards like FHIR are helping to fulfill the promise of interoperability. They're all designed to add patient encounter data to the point of care. Of course, much remains to be done. I'd also like to focus on the other vital element of wisdom development, discovery. We're just in the opening chapters of powerful new capabilities that will transform the entire healthcare ecosystem and touch every participant. These capabilities will amplify and accelerate differential diagnoses and treatment. They'll unlock funds that are currently going through ineffective channels and both simplify and enrich the experience of consumers and healthcare professionals. Meredith's stack of binders was a powerful story. And I think about, as powerful as that is, simply digitizing that volume and that disorder is not going to be, it's an imperative, but yet woefully inadequate and insufficient to be able to actually harness the kind of capabilities that we need to bring to bear through the technologies and the tools and the methodologies that we have. Allow me to share an example that Anthem has developed to accelerate discovery with a committed eye to translation to practice for patient and market impact. Through a unique arrangement between Anthem's subsidiary health plan in California and 7 large health systems in the Southern California region, we identified the need for greater sharing of clinical and administrative information across those collaborating providers. This is, again, I saw something in Meredith's slide around that, and kind of the value-based care types of arrangements, those types of market incentives that start to drive some of that convergence, some of that coherence and sharing. Vivity was created through collaboration between Anthem Blue Cross and 7 hospital systems. In this arrangement, the collaborators are completely accountable to each other. The plan, hospital systems, and physicians all share in upside and downside risk. This unique structure motivates everyone to keep members healthy, manage chronic illnesses, and provide the best, most efficient care for sick patients in ways that no other structure could. The unique structure surrounding Vivity also enables best practice sharing and teams working to deliver an enhanced, integrated customer experience. How do we reduce customer effort? It's one thing to have net promoter scores and driving those kind of pieces and get the promoters, and those are all important things, but how do we reduce customer effort? Those are the metrics and the measures that they're holding us accountable for. Through an interoperability model of obtaining clinical data from these providers and storing in our private HIE, we are able to aggregate the health plan's administrative data, creating a more holistic longitudinal patient record on the members served by that collaboration. As the collaboration progresses, the intention is for the sharing of this information to be conducted through service gateways using the FHIR resources. I also lead our enterprise clinical sharing initiative and the data program, and ultimately it is going to enable us to be able to provide that kind of assistance in coming alongside our providers, coming alongside our members, and really to drive the health and wellness of the nearly 40 million people that we serve. Finally, we believe that people are more than the sum of their claims history, or even in combination with their clinical encounters. There are many critical attributes that are on tap for deeper study that will add to our insights, including cultural factors, behavioral economics, environmental conditions, molecular pharmacology, genetics, and new models of pathophysiology. There remains so much to be done to advance health and wellness. Collaboration is the key. And one thing I would offer, I would love to extend our model that we have in the paper to really look at, I don't know if this is almost an X macro tier, but that will start to complicate things, I'm sure. But to really look at kind of a business ontology for data use agreements. It's one thing to get the mechanics and the plumbing and all those pieces focused, and there's almost this inherent premise that we all assume that people want to share data, and underlies also, I think, the whole need for that data blocking provision in the CARES Act. But if we can start to develop a business ontology, a framework that will allow us to define and then agree on some standard methods of what those use agreements might consist of, it will save me personally just a lot of time on the phone with attorneys and with attorneys from others that we work with in trying to wrestle and drive out those specific terms and agreements to make sure that the security and the privacy is protected, but also that we can tap that research and that data, whether it's through statistically identified data sets and other means, to be able to really harvest the kind of insights that we want to glean out of those rich troves of data. So it's my hope that today's discussion will spark the right kind of fire, one that accelerates the adoption of, and perhaps more importantly, the implementation of interoperability among all the participants. Thanks.
That's contributing to my burnout.
Thank you. All right, last but definitely not least, it's Eyal Oren from Google. So.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I like the statement that I may or may not speak on behalf of my employer. And I am an engineer by training. Interesting, I think all the engineers thought that the doctors actually know what they're doing, but apparently the engineers know. So I work at Google. I work in a team called Google Brain. Google Brain is a team that builds a lot of advanced machine learning for different application areas. You know, when you take pictures with your phone, when you translate using Google, when you do a search, and we also work on healthcare. There is a lot of work on healthcare in Google in a broad spectrum. I will not touch about the other part. I will talk a little bit about what we do in our team. And I think I have a few kind of outsider perspectives that are slightly different than things that have been mentioned in this room, and I'll try to kind of highlight those. So in my team, we have been applying machine learning to different healthcare problems. You may have seen some of the work on imaging. We also recently put out some work on de-identified medical records that you may have seen. And on the medical records, we basically base everything on top of FHIR, and I'll get to that in a second. I think if we think about interoperability the way that people have talked about it also in this room, one way of framing it is you can think about the patient benefits, you can think about the population level analysis of benefits, and you can think about the platform abilities to plug and play architecture. I'll talk a little bit about the population level because that's where we have been spending a little bit of time. And Bob Wachter at UCSF last week, I think, was quoted in a Medium article saying it is immoral not to use the data that we have accumulated in the EHR for improving patient care. And so what we set out to do is say, can we actually consume all the data in the EHR for example, building prediction models? And the reason I want to touch on that is if you actually want to do that across different healthcare systems, across different EHR vendors, across different clinical problems, you cannot go about harmonizing the data upfront, because every kind of harmonization exercise that you do is specific to that vendor, specific to that institution, and specific to the task that you're trying to build for. So if you want to actually harness all the data, you need to not harmonize manually. I'll make a huge caveat that I think previous speakers obviously characterized the huge amount of missing, incomplete, incorrect data in the EHR. Point well taken. Still, I want to make a point about being able to harness the data without explicit harmonization. So what we do is we consume the whole record left to front, and we consume that for millions of patients. And we can consume the claims, we can consume the structured data, the unstructured data, the notes. I want to draw your analogy for a second to something you're very familiar probably with, which is searching on the web. And so when we search on the web, and I think by now most people don't even realize it, there is very, very, very little semantics that people were asked to put into their pages. Most of the work is done afterwards by companies like Google and others that are trying to make sense of the data. There is a limited level of interoperability. There is a container format, HTML. That for me is FHIR. There is some interchange protocol, HTTP. That's HTTP and OAuth, for example, in the FHIR world. And there is some notion of links, URLs, how to get from one place to the other. What you actually write on your page is up to you. Whether you write it in English, in Chinese, in German, it doesn't matter. The job of trying to figure out what is there is left, as an exercise to the reader. And the reason this is very important is, yes, it's very hard, but if you make that data available at scale, in mass, you can do a lot afterwards in trying to harness that data for different tasks. If you spend all your time upfront harmonizing it, you will make very little of the data available because you cannot actually harmonize all of it. So if you, for example, want to make available notes, be it for research and they are de-identified, or be it for care and they are identified, I will not ask you to go and tag all the notes with all the different NLP associations you can make. I will ask you to just make the notes available, because there's a lot of techniques we can use afterwards. Google knows how to do it, but there's a lot of other companies that know how to do it. We can use techniques afterward that run over the notes and try to make sense of it. And so I think we fully recognize that healthcare is a very, very, very difficult space. It's very different than the web. There are very critical decisions being made. The data is very private and sensitive. And on top of that, the data is extremely complex. So I'm not drawing the analogy to the web to kind of convince you that what works on the web works on healthcare, but I'm drawing the analogy to say interoperability means making data available, making a lot of data available, making it available in a standardized manner. It doesn't mean you need to agree on all the semantics all the time for all purposes. You can do a lot afterwards in understanding what is there. And as a small example, some of the work we have done, if you look at those flow sheets that you mentioned in the ICU, right? Most flow sheet data is not harmonized anyway. So there is many different ways you can find respiratory rates in the data. Good luck trying to make sense of that upfront, especially across institutions, especially across EHRs. People switch to EHR 3 times in the last 15 years. But still, if you have a lot of that data and you run computers over it, you can actually learn that all these different flavors of respiratory rates encode something very similar about the patient. So you don't necessarily always need to structure the data upfront completely consistently. I think that was it.
So you can see that the panel has very different perspectives. So I'm going to ask them some questions, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the first question I have is, start with Rob. What are the current incentives for interoperability, and what incentives are needed to be in place for interoperability in procurement?
All right. What are the current incentives? Well, I think it goes beyond, I think it depends on your perspective, obviously, and what you're doing. I think what I read in the paper too last night was, there might be some templates for a guide of what you need, but at the end of the day, you need to look at your business and make sure that your needs are met and putting that in your procurement, because the needs of one health system might be a little different than another that focuses on tertiary care or focuses on whatever it might be. So I think in terms of just incentives from my perspective, and I'll take this doesn't necessarily reflect everyone at my company, but is to make sure that the person has their data available whenever and wherever they go and they need it. I mean, that's what's important in my mind, is that if I am here right now, I can share my medical information if I needed to. It also means that if I wanted to share it with someone for fun or for whatever other reason, for research, if I wanted to donate it, I could do so, and it would be easy for me to do. So I think as a consumer, that's the incentive that I see.
So let me just add, what about it from the corporate view?
What's that?
From the corporate view, from the organization's view?
Of what incentives exist for interoperability?
Just wants to stop that one. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think interoperability, to speak not for Judy, but I mean, in many conversations that I've had with her, interoperability is extremely important. I mean, it is one of the number one priorities and has been ever since I've been on the team, which was 10 years ago when I joined. And, we started Care Everywhere because her husband, a practicing pediatrician, had a patient out of town, ended up in an emergency room, and that kiddo didn't make it. And he told her, if only they would have had the record, they would have known what to do. It wouldn't have been that hard. They could have seen the history. They would have known what to do. And that was the beginning. That was early 2000s when we really started development. Again, there wasn't standard. So it's always been important and will always be important.
Chuck, do you want to?
Sure. One of the things that I think, most of us could probably almost come to the point where we're citing by chapter and verse 164.512. We go through our annual HIPAA certifications that we've been trained and that we've gone through, and what's minimum necessary and the like. And it's something that we all hold very close and dear and we're very careful about. But I wonder if, particularly with some policy folks present, something that would be really helpful from our perspective is to expand that privacy and not the security piece, but expand the privacy model to look at not just what is minimum necessary, but what might be holistically necessary. As we think about and we hear about the value of integrating the data so that we can provide an integrated experience, an integrated care plan for the patient, that requires some underlying policy framework for us to be able to build upon, to be able to enable that, again, without all of the strictures. Because a lot of times we find that people will invoke minimum necessary as a reason for data block, as opposed to really being a true reason. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay.
One last comment on that, because I agree. I've heard that before as a scapegoat or a reason not to share. But there are real concerns, and I think the VA is one of those, that there's a bill being proposed at least that will help them move from more of a strict opt-in to an opt-out for 42CR and all that other stuff. So the complexity of the policies, I think, also makes it challenging for a system-wide approach, because everyone has their own level of comfort with risk.
David.
Anyway, sorry. I'll just add, my 2 bits, and I think this has been talked about a great deal, so it's not a new thought, but it's really important that the current payment models, fee-for-service, that's dominant, doesn't really reinforce the need for interoperability. And the vendors respond to what our clients demand of us, and interoperability is generally fairly low on the priority list. So changing the payment models and shifting to where the demand for interoperability becomes critical to staying in business will shift the procurement and everything else downstream from it, and we'll respond accordingly.
So you've all talked a lot about FHIR, which has been kind of pushed as a next generation way to deal with interoperability. How do you think it's going to impact some of the current interoperability questions? David, you want to start that one off?
Sure. So FHIR is, unlike some of the earlier standards that came through HL7, sort of being battle tested as it evolves, which is, I think, really absolutely critical. A standard that gets invented in a dark room and then balloted and posted as a formal ANSI standard is usually not good for much other than taking up some shelf space. But FHIR has the benefit of being incrementally developed. The Argonaut group dove in and tried to put profiles together on how to use FHIR in draft standard 2 out of a 4-step process. So knowing that it was only halfway finished, we thought it was worthwhile piloting it and using it, trying to find out what the gaps were in the spec itself and what it should do that it wasn't doing, or vice versa, places where it overreached. So I think that bodes well for it in the long run. The downside is the complexity is scope creep is dramatic now. So FHIR's gotten really complicated. It used to be you could understand it in an hour or two of reading, and now it takes a whole lot more than that to get your head around it. So I think the good news is that it's being tested as we develop it. The bad news is that it is still going to be complicated because healthcare is really complicated. So there'll be a little bit of a FHIR backlash probably when people say, this doesn't work for what I want to do. And then the second caveat is that vendor systems are, transactional, have to support massive workloads with high, complete accuracy. They are built on internal tools that were developed long before FHIR was in the head of Graham Grieve. So mapping the FHIR APIs and their definitions and boundaries onto existing vendor systems is not easy work. So a vendor cannot simply slap a FHIR layer on top of their EHR and turn it on. It's hard work. And so expect that it takes time to get it to work across, particularly when you start to move away from read-only into read-write, or the ability to, say, propose an order. That's going to be much more challenging than querying for vital signs and lab results. But we're committed to doing it. We understand the need to do it.
Eyal?
Yeah, so I think, so first of all, internally we have, as I mentioned before, we have basically built our work on top of FHIR. We quickly adopted it. We have been working with the FHIR community. We have been adding a bunch of things that we want to add and make contributions back, and we're open sourcing a whole bunch of stuff around it. So we think it's a very good standard. For a bunch of specific technical reasons, we think it's actually a very good standard. I think I want to actually jump ahead even. So FHIR, in my opinion, just basically raises the bar, because now data is accessible. Now you need to talk about what you do with it. So again, I'll make the analogy with the web. It's just because I think the actual problems are just ahead of us. I realize all the actual technical implementation problems, even getting FHIR and using it, but I think the data quality, as many people have mentioned, that will be obvious. And so if I take the analogy of the web, does anybody know what fraction of emails is spam? It's much more than 85, it's much more than 90. And I'm not sure if I can divulge the exact number, but the reason, for example, that on Gmail you will typically not see it is we filter it, and many other email providers filter it. Does anybody know what fraction of the web is spam? The web, when you search stuff and you get spam, basically a site that wants to steal your credit card, fraud. Okay, I cannot divulge the exact number, but I can tell you, if you think EHR data is messy, if you think EHR data is crappy, look on the web. And so what happens when you make data available is you allow other people to basically develop services on top of that to improve data quality, to filter data away, to make it legible. So that huge stack of files. The problem is not just interoperability. The problem is, how would a human try and consume all that data? That's huge amounts of data, and then half of it is wrong. And so I think it's amazing that Apple is doing this move into the EHR space. Now, the first time you will get your record, half of it is wrong. It just depends on which half. And so making this standard and implementing the standard is great, because it allows other people, innovation in the ecosystem, to come and see what can we do with this data on a population level, on an individual level. And so I think, yeah. And then there is very specific technical reasons why I think we believe FHIR is a very good standard. It's very extensible. You can, at the end of the day, you can basically dump everything you want in it and still make it available. It's very hard to read in that case, but at least it's there.
So Given the recommendation for procuring interoperable IT infrastructures through these modular processing and pushing for the open source infrastructure, what do you think is the short and long-term impact on your business models? Bram, you want to start?
Yeah, it was a hard one. In fact, that was, of the 5, the one that I was hoping I wouldn't get. But and I have to say, listening to my colleague from Google, the whole world is going to get a little disrupted. At least my world is, and maybe I should just focus on collecting data and let him focus on analyzing the data. Having said that, I think the modular approach is forced upon us, and it not only applies to devices, it applies, I think, to data records in the sense that the data will keep on changing. And so I think we just have to, we can't, who said it? That Klootwyk and, let's try it early this morning, said that's probably the okay way to go for a little while. Let's just kludge it a little bit, and then as long as we come back and fix it. But the mere nature of the data changing, despite what you say, is going to require us to continuously have modular upgrades. I don't think we'll have one solution, and DICOM and FIRE, I hear lots of good things about. It is probably a great way to go, but it too will need to be modified as the data changes, as the use of the data changes, and as the technology comes along. So I think that's probably the best way for us to approach that, is not try to answer it in one fell swoop. But I'm sure you guys.
I'll chime in, just thinking about this in light of the meeting today. I don't, and with all due respect to the organizers of the conference in this excellent publication, I don't think procurement is the driver. I think procurement and in agreements across entities to standardize their procurement will react to the drivers. The drivers are regulatory, market forces, and standards work. You can't procure against a standard if the standard doesn't exist. You probably will do what you need to do to survive in your market, but if you have a broken market, which we do in healthcare in many places, it takes a regulatory push to fix that. So I think procurement may be the final common pathway, but the forcing functions are regulatory, market forces, and the ability of standards organizations to produce standards that are both useful immediately and still can be extended and flexible for innovation in the future.
Rob, do you want to add on to that?
Sure. I think thinking outside of the United States, a lot of what we see in procurement and in the RFP world internationally, interoperability is a big key driver there, and it's beyond healthcare spend. Social care is a big driver there, and they spend more money. If you look, there's plenty of charts out there too where, the percent of spend that U.S. has on healthcare is higher than all others, and our outcomes are worse. But if you add in all the social care spend, we're not the highest. We're middle of the pack, and that, I think, is a big thing that we need to figure out how to do a better job driving in that level of work and having that be part of the business entities that are represented here and outside of this room.
Tag on to that a little bit too. It's one of the things that I saw was added as well to the paper was taking things from the point of care to the point of life. I think that as consumers become increasingly impatient with the way the system operates on their behalf and wanting to see that the data is integrated across all their experiences, not just within the four walls of an institution or in their particular experience with their payer, that it's going to be driving that. Many of us are part of either the silver tsunami or the shiny tsunami. We're not going to be patient any longer for the kinds of experiences that are at least by and large what exists out there. When you look at kind of the broader piece of it, if health happens within this broad spectrum of pieces, of which just, let's say, 10% of it is actually in the care system, and yet all of the spend, is in that care system component. The social determinants of health, all those other dimensions of a person's life are far more important to how do we actually engender a different way of approaching habits and behaviors and patterns and selections that exist out there, and how can we help them, driving with some of the social investments that need to be made that will actually have a very strong and mappable derivative effect on their health care as well. I think it's going to be key. It's going to happen because the consumers are going to drive it. They're going to insist upon it.
So I think as we're pointing to these bigger questions, and I think you've all kind of hit it, how do we think interoperability is going to change over time as we become the personalized or precision health approach? And I think Eyal's talked about it again and again. We have advanced, analytics and deep learning, machine learning, data mining. As these become integral to healthcare, as they become just a core of how things work, how do we think that's going to affect interoperability? Eyal, you want to, since you've been talking about it, want to start that off?
Keep us all out.
You've already done that.
So, okay, this is a very difficult question. So I want to go back to, I'll try to answer the question, but I want to go back to, I think, what David said before. There is, if quality doesn't earn you money, there is no incentive for sharing data, because the value of the data is better quality. If quantity earns you money, you have the inverse incentive, because giving data out reduces quantity, right? Like Julia showed. So I think we have technologies, and I think it's very clear we have technologies that are able to amass tremendous amount of insights, potentially recommendations, learnings from vast amounts of data. But how and whether they will actually transform reality for people, I think it depends on the fundamental driver. And the fundamental driver is, I think, always money. And so I think it's kind of very interesting if you compare, I don't mean to do this kind of, but if you compare, for example, advertisement, where Google happens to earn a lot of their money, and I happen to work in there, in digital advertising, making a better placement of showing this ad to this person literally earns you money. So now a tremendous amount of innovation is spurned, because if you can better predict, if you can better harness that data, you deliver a better experience, but you also earn money. In healthcare, we're extremely far from that. We're extremely far from that. So yes, I think we will have a lot of technologies that will increase quality a lot. How and whether they will actually impact reality, I think, is to be seen. You know, it all depends on the ecosystem, on the revenue model, on the reimbursement model for providers and payers and integrated systems.
Bram, you want to?
Just a little comment. I agree with you. It is for us about the money and making a profit. And what we at G firmly believe is that if you put the patient in front of that question and you look at outcomes, the money stream, if you will follow. As we talk about AI and machine learning changing interoperability, or the other way around, is quite possible. Ultimately, one thing we haven't talked about is whether or not the outcomes justify the means and the interoperability. We all have a gut sense that, hey, if the data is universally available, and if I'm a patient that has a stroke in Minnesota, as a good friend of mine had, moved to Salt Lake City, and it took 3 weeks to get treatment because the records couldn't get moved, you think that would get better. You would have better healthcare, more healthier people, the cost of healthcare goes down, and eventually we make more money. But we have to somewhere build into this ecosystem some outcomes work. And I strongly encourage all the other sessions I've sat through where we skip that step. If the outcomes don't justify it, don't bother.
So I think I'm going to open this up for questions now. If just please say your name and speak into the microphone.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm the physician that Lori McGraw brought to this meeting. I'm Michael Hodgkins with the AMA, and Eyal, I have to, I'll paraphrase something you said earlier, which really caught my attention, and that was a version of write it down and we'll figure out how to make useful data out of it. And that's music to almost every physician's ear that I can think of, because the pendulum has swung way too far towards the end of the spectrum, where physicians, nurses, other members of the healthcare team are being employed to be data entry clerks instead of doing clinical care. And so they spend their days in templates, they spend their days in drop-down lists, picking things off. And in the end, we may have more discrete data, but we don't have a narrative about the care process. We don't have a context for what's going on with the patient that can be shared from healthcare team member to healthcare team member. And I'm wondering, especially for those of you that are developing products, whether EHR or medical devices, how you view this and what efforts you're making to get the pendulum to swing back a little bit more towards not burdening the healthcare team to be data entry clerks.
I have a couple of pet peeves in this space. One is a lot of what drives the unacceptable approach to clinical documentation in current EHRs is the reimbursement process. As you know, the E&M codes reward you for higher pay if you put more stuff in the notes. That has to change if we want to get back to systems that allow clinicians to document what's actually useful and meaningful in the context of an evolving case. When I first came to Cerner, we built a system that, this was in 1991, a long time ago, pre-E&M. We built a system that allowed clinicians to just do notes down the page like you would on a paper record, and you could say, agree with above, except I hear an S3, increase the Lasix, and the resident could say, agree, done, and everybody knew exactly what had happened. You can't write notes like that anymore because your reimbursement would crash. We'd be happy to go back and reinvent clinical documentation if those rules were changed, the reimbursement, the rules around clinical documentation and reimbursement. So that's my pet peeve. With respect to Eyal's point, I think it's important to make a little bit of a caveat. He's talking about extracting meaning out of terabytes of textual data run through hundreds of thousands of hours of neural net learning. That's not applicable at the scale of an individual patient in a decision support rule firing in the context of an EHR. So it's a great way to learn things, but it's not a great way to deploy things. So we need some structure to be able to trigger those decision support rules to do the simple predictive analytics that we need to do sort of instantaneously and without a large infrastructure behind. Now, in the long run, those will kind of fuse and blend together, but you can't avoid some structure. But I think we need to right-size the amount of structure by first changing those reimbursement rules so that you only document stuff that's really important. Evidence-based documentation. It's a Jim Walker phrase that I love to quote. Some of you know Jim.
And then Julian.
Hi, thanks. I'm Ross Martin with CRISP, which is a health information exchange in Maryland and DC and West Virginia. Wow, I've got 12 things going on in my head, so I'll just distill it down to a couple of comments. And thank you, David, for bringing up your last point, because that was one of my closers. And maybe we can end with the question about Eyal's thoughts around how do you manage the blending of that population health view that you're dealing with making it relevant for the individual patient. But I just want to point out first, as a health information exchange, one of our jobs is to connect with vendors like Epic and Cerner and GE. I will just note that 3 of the largest vendors are represented here, but we deal with the hundreds of little guys and gals out there that have built their own EHR certified products, right? Meaningful use certified products that it is brutally painful to connect with. And it's hard to connect with Epic and Cerner even at this level, but they've got people that we can talk to and get on the phone and get in meetings, and they're great collaborators on this, and they're very engaged in it. But I want us to not forget that this is such a complex level, and I think we're we've talked about the device level a lot, and we've talked about the EHR level a lot. When you add in social determinants of health, like was mentioned globally, and the many, many other spaces where healthcare really hits the reality, we've got a massive, massive scale problem here that I don't think lends itself to simple answers, but I'd like to maybe I'd like some input on that question, and then if you could follow up just with that population versus single. Thank you.
I'm not sure I've heard the question in there necessarily. But oh, the hundreds of others and whatnot. So from my perspective, that's less about what Epic says and more about what our customers do in terms of prioritizing how are they going to work with community providers. We've helped them create stuff for their websites about how can people connect. So we give them the solutions, the answers, and then they generally say, here's how, this is our program, this is how we can connect and operate. Some might be, our regional HIE does a great job of connecting you up. Let's go through that, and they're connected. I know we have plenty of our clients that are connected through CRISP. I think I'll comment a little bit on what you were teasing up over there, and also the previous question about precision medicine. I think it's incredibly important to be able to have that level of information for a single person, so not necessarily the hundreds of thousands of hours of neural net learning, but to be able to go up somewhere and find out what is working for a patient with all of the similar things, because likely someone has been in a similar situation with a similar set of diagnoses, similar set, at least similar enough to where you can have some learning and paint a narrative, as Michael said, where I don't necessarily need to read through 1,000 pages of their history, but I can have a longitudinal plan of care that's easy to digest, something, a suggested care pathway that's been proven, by Mayo or others, and here's how I can get to those outcomes. And if they go off track, it'll alert me, and then I can get them back on track. So having all the devices connected that are personal to, I think that's all part of the puzzle on an individual level that you can leverage population level data to have better outcomes.
So I'll comment on population versus patient. First, I wanted to say two other things because afterwards I realized I said it maybe in a crummy way. I also did not intend to make any actual marketing for Google as a company. A lot of the things I discussed, there's a lot of other people doing work in this space. There's a lot of deep learning happening on the EHR. I'm just, I think, a spokesman for this idea or this approach. That's number one. Number two, when I said there is a lot of bad data in the EHR, I didn't mean to complain about particular vendors. I think it's just a reality. If you look in the data, there is a lot of bad data. It's partly, device don't talk, partly human error. There is a lot of data entry errors and stuff. And there is, of course, like systemic reasons. Now about patient versus population. So when you take a picture here, there's a bunch of stuff happening on the phone. It's a deep learning model that was trained over 100,000 of hours, and then it's played on your local telephone with trivial amounts of CPU, I would say, in comparison to the training cycle. So in all these modeling efforts, there is always a training cycle, and then there is the actual inference cycle. The training cycle can be very expensive. In our case, indeed, it can be hundreds of thousands of hours of computation power. The inferencing happens on the individual patient, on the real-time data that is known about that individual patient, and can be instantaneous. And so one reason, for example, to come back about your question about FHIR, one reason we are very excited about FHIR is if you look at a Smart on FHIR app, somebody could expose these kind of models as a Smart on FHIR app or like a CDS hooks app that gets the most recent information known about this patient, runs the inferencing stage of this model and returns something. And this inferencing step could be run on a mobile phone, technically. So there is a very clear connection between understanding things at the population level and being able to apply them on the individual patient.
But I want to come back to Ross's question about smaller vendors. I mean, I think there's some consolidation, obviously, that is going to solve some of those problems for what that's worth, one way or the other. It's just what happens. But I think another sort of theoretical benefit of this TEFCA model would be that if a vendor integrates with what TEFCA calls a QHIN, which is your gateway to the rest of the network, then that one interface to that one QHIN is your on-ramp, presumably reducing the number and complexity of the interfaces that you have to write. So a lot of stuff has to happen for this to actually prove out and be acceptable or sustainable and successful in the market, but at least there's, I think, a path that says if you can connect to a QHIN in the TEFCA framework, then most of your core patient care interoperability could be mediated through that connection. That's part of the proposal for TEFCA that's attractive. It reduces the need for custom peer-to-peer interfaces, hopefully way down.
All right, Julian, you have 1 minute for your question, so let's.
All right. The question won't take long. The answer might take longer.
No.
So I think this is a question for David and for Bram and for Eyal, and it's stimulated by the idea of looking at one patient's data and interpreting it using the most advanced technologies. So it seems that's what's needed to do that is an appropriate set of metadata and a reasonable amount of information about a signal. You might have to know the sample rate, for example, to interpret the data, or the averaging time of a pulse oximeter, as we talked about this morning. So there are characteristics. Was the respiratory rate measured from a pulse oximeter? Some of them do that, or from an ECG leads. So the question, Bram, is how could you expose the kind of data that Eyal or others need to do the kind of deep learning that's theoretically and technically possible today to start to give us much more value from our healthcare data? It seems that you two could work out 70% of that, and 30% has to be by folks who understand, who could advise you on some of those clinical inputs that you might need. That should be under a minute.
Yeah, and the answer won't be. I actually thought you were going to go down a different path, which is how do you leverage population health to have better and richer, more robust information? In other words, we talked a little bit about the clinician's burden, and I've heard several chair people say my radiologists are just bored. Not bored, they're just they've got way too much to do. There's way too much normal data, and I think that's where the population health and the machine learning will come in, is to eliminate a lot of these steps and a lot of the data entry steps, because the data that'll come back from a scanner will be much richer, and all of the normal stuff will just be pre-read, if you will. But your question is a little bit more complex, and that is, does the data that we provide to a learning algorithm need to be better curated? I think that brings us back to where the device probably needs to have higher levels of data tagging. And we are working on that. We are working on machines and devices that are smarter, that automatically interpret before it even leaves the scanner. We are working on ways that there's better interoperability among the systems. However, having said all of that, I'd love to hear Eyal's response, because he just told me, just get me the data, it doesn't matter.
Eyal, you get to end it.
Okay. So the answer is a little bit complicated. I'll do the easy stuff first. So the easy stuff is you will always need subject experts. And number two, real magic does not exist. That's the easy stuff. Now, I think the part that is a little bit more surprising and a little bit less kind of believable until you actually see it is that if you gave me coded observations, in some coding scheme that you will not give me the key to, with values, and there are units, but you also will not tell me the units, but you give it to me for 1 million patients over time, we actually are pretty good at learning which of these observations seem to be describing the same concept. And this has been demonstrated over and over again, not just by us, but by other people outside of healthcare in a general domain. You learn the meaning of things based on the context in which they appear, as long as you see enough of it. So there is a lot you can learn without getting the key, the semantic disambiguation. And we have seen this on medications, for example, where yes, we can use RxNorm, but we don't need to use RxNorm. We learn that all of these are vasopressors. You see this on labs. Yes, we can use LOINC, but we don't need to use LOINC. We learn that all of these are flavors of glucose measurements. So there is a lot you can learn from looking at the data. You will, in my opinion, always want to have clinician involvement to make sure that you actually do what you think you're doing, because real magic does not actually exist.
So with that, we're going to end this session. I just want to say, I think this gets to the point where you have to bring the people together to be able to do this. It just doesn't work. You have expertise across the board. So I want to say thank you to our panel. So.
Thank you.